So coming in at number 10, we have Anna Begenholm, and let's call her Ice Woman. She was born in 1970 in Vandenberg, Sweden. Well, in 1999, she had a skiing accident that left her trapped underneath a layer of ice for 80 minutes in freezing water. During that time, she became a victim of extreme hypothermia, and her body decreased to 56.7 degrees Fahrenheit. For a normal person, it's about 98. So Anna was able to survive because she was able to find an air pocket underneath the ice, and she was just like breathing through it. But she suffered from circulatory arrest after 40 minutes of being in the water. So a rescue team found her and airlifted her by helicopter to the nearest hospital. A team of 100 doctors and nurses worked in shifts for a period of 9 hours to try to save her life. So she was in a coma for 10 days, and guess what? She woke up. So since the accident, she has made an almost full recovery. The reason why she was able to survive was because her body completely froze before her heart stopped beating. She was literally frozen in time. Coming in at number 9, we have Vesna Vulovic, and let's call her the Flying Woman. Vanessa was a stewardess on board Flight 367 back in 1972. Her plane went down while flying over East Germany on its route from Stockholm to Belgrade when the plane exploded from Croatia terrorists who planted a bomb on the plane. So the plane broke into two, and Vanessa flew right out of the plane. So she fell 10,160 meters to the ground. The plane then crashed into a mountain near a village, killing everyone, leaving her as the sole survivor. She suffered a fractured skull, 3 broken vertebrae. She was temporarily paralyzed from the waist down and also had 2 broken legs. She went into a coma for 27 days, but now she was fully recovered from the accident. She was then put into the Guinness World Records books for the highest jump out of an airplane without a parachute and to live to tell the story. Moving on, Roy Sullivan. Let's call him the Lightning Man, and he comes in at number 8. He is a United States Park Ranger when he was hit by lightning on 7 different occasions and survived all of them. He was recognized by the Guinness World Records books as the person who has been struck by lightning by more than any other human. His first strike was back in 1942 when he lost his big toenail. In 1969, he lost his eyebrows and he was knocked unconscious. 1970, he was left with a really bad shoulder scar. In 73, he was struck right in the head. 1977, his most recent one and his most serious one. It took him to the hospital. So this story about Roy Sullivan actually ends on a sad note. At the age of 71 years old, he actually took his own life with a gunshot wound. Alright, at number 7, we have Truman Duncan, and let's call him Miracle Half Man. The 38-year-old man was working at his job at a railway. He was on the train when he slipped and fell right in front of the train. He was pulled right underneath the train, being dragged by the wheels for 75 feet. And then his body couldn't take it anymore. He was ran right over and cut right into 2. Miraculously enough, he was able to call 911 on his own cell phone. He closed his eyes and just waited for help to come. He fought to stay alive. And when the emergency teams came and put an IV in him, that's when lights were out for Truman. Anything after that, he does not remember. So he woke up 2 to 3 weeks later and realized that he's still alive. He lost both his legs and his kidney. During the time when he was in a coma, doctors only gave him 1 in a million chances of living. He fought all odds, undergoing 23 major surgeries, and now he lives to share his story. He has shared it with ABC and even the Oprah Winfrey Network. Remarkable enough, he went back and he's working at the same job. Okay, moving on to Louis Zamperini, and let's call him Unbroken. You guys remember that movie that came out that was directed by Angelina Jolie? Well, that movie was based from a true story, and it's Louis's life. He was an American prisoner of the war who survived in World War II. He also had an Olympic career. Well, his life took a turn when his plane crashed into the sea. He was able to get onto a raft and just float the sea until he was able to reach land or until he was saved. Well, he was out on sea for 47 days. He survived many shark attacks. There was a plane that dropped bombs on him. This is like the enemy of the war. He had to jump in the water and avoid being blown up. So on day 47, he found this island, but bad luck for him, it was of the enemy. He walked into a Japanese camp that took him prisoner. Well, guess what? He was able to survive all that, win the war. Louis eventually went on to live a very old age at 97 years old. He has lived the most amazing events in history. Now we have Carlos Rodriguez at number 5. And let's call him the man with half a head. He lost a large portion of his brain and skull after flying through his car front window and landing on his head during a serious car accident. This picture that you guys are looking at right now, everyone thinks that this is fake, this is impossible, this is photoshopped. Well, no, this is real, and this is the guy's true story. Doctors were forced to cut away large portions of his head and skull to try to keep this guy alive during the brutal accident that he went through. So he's missing a lot of flesh and bone. He has fully recovered, and amazing enough, he's living a very normal life. Very lucky guy. So the accident happened when he was 14 years old. He was on a lot of drugs and decided to go out driving. He hit into a pole and went flying right out the front window because he didn't have a seatbelt on. Well, he was arrested, but he spent most of his time at the hospital. Coming in at number 4, Aaron Ralston. Or you know what, better known as 127 Hours. I know what you guys are thinking.
Oh my god, Landon, I freaking love that movie.
Well, this is another movie based out of a true story. Aaron was the man behind the movie that was played by James Franco. In 2003, in southeastern Utah, he had an accident where he fell from a cliff when a boulder fell on his right forearm, keeping him trapped there. He was stuck there for 5 days, which was 127 hours. He resorted to amputating his own arm with a dull knife in order to get himself free. And if you guys go on YouTube right now, his original footage, not from the movie footage, Aaron's video is on YouTube and you guys can watch the real thing. And he even talks about what he had to go through to cut his arm off. It was brutal. So once this guy was free, he was still far from safety. He had to rappel down 65 feet and walk for hours to try to find some help. During this time, he lost 40 pounds and 25% of his blood, but somehow he found the strength to survive. So now he considers himself as reborn. Okay, moving on. Finally, at number 3, we have Julianne Kopacki, or let's call her sole survivor. At the age of 17 years old, she was on a plane in 1954 that crashed into a mountain in Vietnam after being struck by lightning due to a severe thunderstorm. The flight was Lanza Flight 508 and it was en route from Lima, Peru to Pucallpa, Peru. There was 92 people on board and one of them being her mom. Well, Julianne was the only survivor who survived the 10,000 feet fall. The whole time she was still strapped to her seat, so she fell to the bottom of the forest. She was knocked out for a whole day. When she woke up, she realized that she's the sole survivor. So this is when she knew she needed to find help, try to find a village or something. So in the forest, she was being eaten alive by bugs and maggots. So she learned something that her father taught her because her mom and dad are actually scientists. And she knew to get rid of all these bug bites, she needed to burn them away by getting gasoline and pouring it all over her body. But you know what? It worked. 11 days later, she was saved. So much later in time, investigators found out that her mother actually also survived the crash, but she died in the forest. Okay, moving on. At number, we have Wenceslas Mogel, and he is the Bullet Man. Back on March 18, 1915, he was captured while fighting in the Mexican Revolution War. Without trial, he was sentenced to be executed by a firing squad. A firing squad is a method of capital punishment. It was very common during the war. It's where a team of people come together, get their guns out, and when they're ready, they start shooting. They start shooting at vital organs, which is usually the head. Wenceslas was shot 9 times, including a final bullet from close distance right to the head because they wanted to make sure that he was dead. But miraculously enough, he survived, and guess what? He was actually able to escape. So he went on to live a full life. This famous picture that you guys have been seeing throughout this whole thing, it was taken in 1937 in NBC studios after 20 years after he was shot. He was talking about his story, and after that he went on to travel with the Ripley's Believe It or Not crew around the world. And finally, at the number 1 spot, we have Fran Selak. And let's call him the world's luckiest man. Fran is a Croatian music teacher. Back in 1962, Fran was riding a train through a cold, rainy canyon when the train flipped off the tracks and crashed into the river. He survived from a broken arm and hypothermia. The next year, during his first and only plane ride, he was blown out of a malfunctioning plane door and landed in haystacks. 3 years after that, he got on a bus that skid off a road and landed into a river. Fran managed to swim to shore with only cuts and bruises. In 1970, his car caught on fire. He managed to escape before the fuel tank blew up. 3 years later, the engine of his car was doused with hot oil, causing flames to shoot through the vents, but he survived. In 1955, he was struck by a bus in Zagreb, which is in Croatia, but sustained only minor injuries. Moving on to 1996, he was involved with a head-on collision on a mountain curve, which caused him to get ejected from his car, and he somehow landed in a tree while his car plummeted to the ground. down 300 feet. It sounds so unbelievable, but he has escaped death 7 times, making him the world's luckiest man. It's almost like a movie, but it doesn't end there. Unbelievably, when he turned 73 years old, he won $1 million from the lottery. This is like the luckiest, unluckiest guy.
Kicking off our list at number 10, first class passengers. While traveling in first class, it might feel more comfortable at first, but when it came to the sinking of the Titanic, first class passengers had a better chance at survival. You would think obviously, but here's why. Just over 200 first class passengers survived out of the 324 souls traveling in first class during that fateful voyage. That's a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people passed away, but in hindsight, a lot of people made it. If you've seen the James Cameron film, you know women and children were first to board these lifeboats. And then afterwards, it was first class men. See, by that point, there were few lifeboats left, which I'll get into, of course, later on. But second class and third class, their chances at survival here, right off the bat, were not great, simply because they were divided by class. Being stored further and lower from these lifeboats, the odds weren't in their favor. There were more than 700 third class passengers, and that number exceeded the other 2 classes combined. It's horrible. Those rooms were crammed. 4 people would have to share one tiny room, and the beds were smaller than twin beds. So when it comes to evacuating quickly, sadly these passengers had the hardest time getting out, which we don't often think of when we think of, the Titanic and the sinking of it. Number 9, the band. We know how passionate musicians can be, and we know that music can heal a lot of people, of course. While I'm absolutely sure there is nothing that could have been done to completely erase people's worries about what was about to happen on the Titanic that fateful night, the ship's orchestra did what they could, which was to play music, and I'm sure that helped somebody in some way, shape, or form. It wasn't just in the movie, right? The 8 orchestra members continued to play as the ship sank in order to try and keep spirits up. First, it was widely believed that they did this because they were ordered to, and for the record, if this were the case, that still would have been insanely brave of them too, but it turns out this is far from the truth. See, the band members were in fact not ship employees at the time, which means they technically had the same rights as any other passenger to leave and board a ship, but they chose not to. They all unfortunately passed away in the sinking of the ship, and they played until they couldn't anymore, which I think is horribly sad, but also very beautiful and heroic of them. The film can't quite capture the beauty. I'm sure that their heroism helped a lot of people who are also in this terrible situation, and I'm glad their acts have been remembered, even still. Number 8, locked doors. Ellen Hakarian was aboard the Titanic that fateful night, and Tanky magazine actually published her survival story afterwards, titled Going Down with the Titanic in Third Class. Yeah, I mentioned the first class differences between third class, so this story here is already a feat in itself. Ellen and her husband, Pekko, decided to leave Finland and start a new life in America. The night of April 14th, after the couple had returned to their cabin and got settled in, they heard a loud scraping sound, and the engines then started to act up. Pekko ran out to see what was going on. The hallway was tilted by the time Ellen poked her head out moments later, once she heard a ruckus in the hallway. Then there was a knock at the door. One of her friends from Finland came in, and they said the ship was sinking, but Pekko was nowhere to be seen, and her friend asked, how did he get out of the passageway? All the doors are locked. I was confused. I didn't know what to do next. After a few moments, I grabbed my purse and life jacket and ran out to the passageway. The door was locked. All the doors were locked. A steward finally came along to guide the crew to third deck, where they were then taken to the Carpathia, and they didn't arrive to a safe ship until the sun was up the following day. So after losing her husband and all of her belongings, Ellen only received $125. That's all the ship could give them. They're like, we're sorry you lost everything, here's the best we can do. That's it. Number 7, no binoculars. On that fateful night of the collision with the iceberg, binoculars were locked up the entire time. Now, of course, this could have changed literal history had they have been used, but why weren't they? The key to said lockup storing the binoculars was being held by Officer David Blair. Only before the Titanic's departure from Southampton, Officer Blair was pulled from the crew. Now, of course, this may not have made a difference at all, but it's important to note. To think that these were stashed in a locker in the crow's nest the entire time is haunting now when you consider the history of it. The poor guy was transferred to another ship and forgot a key. The amount of times I've forgotten a key or taken a work key home by accident, I mean, it's a simple mistake, but in this case, tragedy, really. Number 6, ignored flares. Just 20 miles away from where the Titanic sunk, there was another boat. This one was called the SS Californian. This boat had stopped in order to avoid the ice, and the crew on the Titanic had also received warnings about icebergs. The Titanic had received 6 warnings about icebergs before the collision. Now, while the first few warnings were received by the captain, not all 6 were. Why so? The captain of this other boat, he slowed down and actually saw the emergency flares being set off on the Titanic ahead, but he ignored them because he thought that they were company rockets. The SOS signals that the Titanic was sending out weren't received until the next day because the radio operator on that SS Californian had gone to sleep. Yep, he took a little power nap after ignoring all the flares. By the time they had heard these calls and arrived the next day, it was obviously too late, sadly. Number 5, less lifeboats. Before the Titanic even set sail during the preparation for the journey, at some point, people made a decision to reduce the number of lifeboats that were on board. Why they did this? Beats me, I don't know. They did this because they didn't want to clutter the deck, which is truly trivial when we're talking about the safety of, 2,208 passengers that were on board that day. The number of lifeboats ended up being reduced to just 20, with an additional 4 that were, collapsible. So 24-ish lifeboats, 2,208 passengers. Doesn't add up. It's not. It's a terrible ratio. Which means they should have had time to launch every single one, but this would still be only enough for half the passengers on board. It was cursed from the get-go. And as you may or may not know, during the sinking of the ship, not even all the lifeboats were able to be launched as everything happened too quickly, and it was chaos. There are quite a few lessons that can be definitely learned from the sinking of the Titanic, because the more we learn, the more we realize that the safety precautions taken for these ships simply were just not up to par. It wasn't really about the iceberg. That did it, but there were other things that could have helped. Number 4, the card. In the remnants of the Titanic, there was an inspection card found that belonged to a woman named Marianne Meanwell. This must seem like any ordinary find after a wreck, but it revealed a grim story for the woman. Once the card was found, it was then revealed that Marianne was not intended to be on the Titanic at all, but by some turn of events, she unfortunately found herself as one of the passengers. The card shows us that she was originally meant to be traveling on a ship called the Majestic, but for some reason, the trip she'd originally planned was delayed, and she instead was assigned to the ill-fated Titanic. You can see the word Majestic was actually crossed out on her card, which shows us the change in plans. It's so haunting to look at now. There's no way anybody could have known or warned her. It's just a really tragic situation to look back on. And to physically see the cancellation of the ship gives me goosebumps. That's really horrible. Number 3, Eliza Melvina Dean. This story really is something, okay? Buckle up. When thinking back to this tragedy, it's hard to imagine how it looked in real time, like being on the ship, right? Not from James Cameron's perspective, right? It was a moonless night in the pitch black. Of course the navigation was hard. Of course it could have been handled better, or they could have listened to the numerous warnings, but again, it was pitch black. This is what the iceberg looked like in real life. Eliza Dean was only a newborn on the Titanic. Her parents were on the way to the States with everything that they owned packed up in their luggage. See, Eliza's father was actually on the deck at the time of the collision, so he saw the ship hit that iceberg. How terrifying is that? But in doing so, he knew in that moment, get the family, hit the deck, something bad's gonna happen. Even as third-class passengers, they were thankfully some of the first on the lifeboats, which is incredible seeing as what I said earlier. It was Eliza, her brother, and her mother. They all got aboard safely, but her father, of course, never made it off, which is terrible, but his quick thinking saved his family. Number 2, John Jacob Astor. As the ship was sinking, the first-class passenger, John Jacob Astor, he put his young wife on one of the lifeboats, and he was about to get in with her when he immediately saw 2 terrified children standing behind him. And it happened. He instead gave up his spot and let those other 2 children on the boat, which is just noble, it's brave, it's heroic. It's something that you ask yourself, could I do that? If it actually were to happen, would I have the willpower to do that? I hope so. This is absolute bravery. One of the Titanic survivors, named Philip Mock, saw John in one of his final moments later on after this brave moment. He saw him and his valet huddled together on one of the life rafts before they unfortunately froze in the cold water. It's tragic. This was indeed a very tragic event, but the positive news here is that both his wife and the child that she was carrying at the time were able to make it to safety, and they survived the entire ordeal. While there are many terrible stories from this day, we also don't hear enough about the bravery that people showed during this tragic event. And finally, number 1, Molly Brown. In total, there were 706 people who survived the sinking of the Titanic. Molly Brown has been referred to as the unsinkable Molly Brown. And when you look into her story, it really checks out. Margaret Brown not only survived the Titanic, which is just an incredible feat in itself, and the odds there are just incredible, but once aboard the life ship, she threatened the quartermaster. She said she'll throw him overboard if he didn't go back immediately and start looking for more survivors. That's badass. That is something I will do. I hope I can do in a moment like this. That's incredible. Historically, this is where the accounts get a little hazy. See, it's not confirmed whether the boat actually went back to look, but after narrowly surviving a tragedy, then you're barely conscious. You still think of other people? That's the moral of the story here. Margaret was traveling in Egypt, but when a grandchild got sick, she ended her trip early just to go back to the States and take care of them. When she got all this attention after surviving said disaster, she then campaigned publicly for women's rights and education for the poor. She was a badass in the boat and then a badass afterwards. Like, this is insane. There was a musical comedy in the 60s called The Unsinkable Molly Brown, so her name will be remembered for a while. As it should be. Thank you, Molly.
Starting off this countdown, we have the Johnson family. It's hard enough being stuck in quarantine with your family. I can't imagine how it would be stuck on a deserted island with them. In the early 90s, the Johnson family headed out sailing on their family boat. However, the family of 4 encountered some rough waters, which resulted in their boat tipping over. Unable to save their small boat, they watched it sink right before their eyes as they bobbed up and down in the freezing cold waters. The family ended up making it to a nearby island and survived there for nearly 40 days. They would collect rain droplets for drinking and caught turtles and fish as their food source. Thankfully, they were rescued by a local fisher who saw them on the island. That's definitely one method of family bonding. Coming in at number 9, we have the canoe trip. Back in August of this year, a mother and her child went on a little canoe trip in northern Saskatchewan, and they certainly weren't prepared for what was going to happen to them. That afternoon, the current was so strong that they were swept away and ended up at an unoccupied island. The wind was so strong that no matter what they did, they couldn't gain control of their canoe. They were stuck on the island for just a day before they were rescued. In our 8th spot, we have HELP. Back in 2016, 3 men were deserted on a remote island near Micronesia after their boat capsized in the South Pacific island. The 3 men originally had plans for a short sailing trip, but the weather became brutal and tipped over their boat. And it was at night when this happened, so they swam 2 miles in the dark until they reached land. From there, they used palm leaves to spell out the word help on the island's sand. Thankfully, the men were only stranded for 3 days before a US Navy plane spotted their fire and then their sign and came to their rescue. In our 7th spot, we have Philip Ashton. In June of 1722, fisherman Philip Ashton joined a crew who planned to sail the waters of Nova Scotia. But while at sea, the crew was captured by pirates, and Philip was held as their captive. For 9 months, Philip was stuck being the pirates' prisoner. But all of that changed in March of 1723. That's when they docked on shore and Philip made a run for it. The pirates searched for him briefly before giving up and getting back on the boat. Philip was then left stranded on the island all alone with no tools or food. But he managed to make a little shelter and ate fruit and turtle eggs to survive. 16 months later, a British ship rescued Philip, and he lived to tell the tale, and even wrote a book about it. Coming in at number 6, we have the Friends. Back in 2012, friends Jesse Brillin and Brian and Dave Martinuke were out boating when the strong winds and rough waters caused their boat to capsize. They managed to pull the inflatable raft from the boat and spent 15 hours drifting hopelessly. Eventually, they drifted close to land, where they were stranded for 10 days. They used driftwood to build a shelter and ate sea urchins, seaweed, and clam beds for food. On the 10th day, a sailboat spotted the trio's pile of garbage on shore before seeing the men and rescuing them. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the SOS. A couple of months ago in August, 3 sailors got stranded on an island after attempting to make a 23 nautical mile journey. However, they ended up getting lost and their boat ran out of fuel. They were stranded on this island for 3 days before being rescued by the Australian and US authorities. During these 3 days, they managed to make a small shelter and a large SOS sign out of debris. On the 3rd day, this sign was spotted by a passing aircraft, and that was the reason why they were found. Moving on at number 4, we have the river monsters. This next man got found by sheer accident. He's actually quite lucky. So in 2016, a fisherman was out sailing when he decided to leave his boat to go to try and find better oysters. But on his journey back, he got sunstroke and couldn't go any further. As a result, he had to spend the night on the beach. The next morning, he tried to travel back some more, but again, the heat and sun were too much for him. By then, his boat was gone and he was stuck on the island. But lucky for him, a TV series called River Monster arrived on the island as they were using it as their filming location. That's when they came across the fisherman, who ran out of the cave to the crew naked, flailing his arms all about. The crew literally saved his life. Now, this man is so lucky because the crew weren't even supposed to film at this island in the first place. They were planning on using a different island, but changed locations last minute due to choppy waters. Little did they know that by doing this would save a man's life. In our third spot, we have Ada Blackjack. In 1921, Ada Blackjack struggled to take care of her son who was suffering from tuberculosis. In order to make more money for her son's treatments, Ada joined a team of explorers as a cook and seamstress. But the journey didn't go as planned. Quickly, they were out of food and had to go hunt to obtain more. Ada was left to care for a crewman, Lorne Knight, who was suffering from scurvy, while the others went to go look for more food. They never returned for Ada or Lorne. From there, she had to learn how to survive. She would trap and kill wild animals for her and Lorne. Sadly, Lorne passed away, but Ada managed to survive for 2 years alone. On August 19th, 1923, Ada was rescued by one of the men that left her there in the first place. Like, the nerve that dude had to come back after all those years. I would have been pissed. Like, yes, I'm here, I'm still alive, thank you for leaving me. In our second spot, we have the Castaways. Now, this story is a bit different than the rest of the ones on the list. In this case, the two wanted to be left on a deserted island. So back in 1980, a British writer put an ad in Time Out magazine saying that he wanted a female to live with him on a deserted island. I don't know about you, but I would be a little sketched out by that ad. But one lady, Lucy Irvine, was intrigued by it, and so the two set out to Toon Island. Now, she was only 24 years old, but the British writer was 49. Now, he didn't plan this through enough, because there wasn't enough fresh water to sustain them and hardly any vegetation on this island. The two survived on the island for about a year when they were saved by some islanders. If it wasn't for them, they wouldn't have survived because they were running out of the necessities. Story goes that Lucy was the one keeping them both alive, but the other dude, on the other hand, had given up faith a number of times. He didn't think they were gonna make it. And in our number one spot, we have Alexander Selkirk. Alexander Selkirk was a Scottish man who is famous for surviving on an island for 4 years. So in October of 1704, Selkirk was a part of a crew sailing around Cape Horn. But the crew started to become very sick. Many were dying of disease and their food supply was diminishing. Plus the food that they did have was all infested with worms. And the ship was in rough shape. So he told the captain they should just abandon the ship and wait for help. The captain was not too fond of this idea. And so Alexander got off the ship and waited around on a deserted island thinking that another ship would be along shortly. Well, shortly was 4 years and 4 months later. All he was left with was some clothing, a musket, some tools, a Bible, and tobacco. To survive, he found fresh water, ate goats and seals and plums, and he even tamed a wild cat to keep him company and to keep the vermin away from him while he slept. Starting off this countdown, we have Tony Sikoria. In 1994, a man named Tony Sikoria was struck by lightning while talking to his mom on a payphone. When he was struck, he felt his body fly backward, and then he flew forward. He turned around and he saw his own body laying on the ground. He stared at himself and felt nothing. Then he saw a woman start CPR on him. As this was going on, Tony began to float upwards. He was now floating up the stairs of his house and saw his kids getting their face painted. Then all of a sudden he was surrounded by a bluish white light and he felt at peace. Then bam, he was back. He had been revived at the hospital. That story is just crazy for so many different reasons. Coming in at number 9, we have Miss Zilla. This story was shared by Ed Zilla. He shared the story on behalf of his wife. A couple of years ago, his wife died twice in 3 months, but was successfully resuscitated both times. But the resuscitation took a long time, almost hours. Later, she shared with him what she experienced. According to her, she remembered nothing. There was just blackness. No light, no relatives, no former pets, just blackness. But there was also no pain. Okay, so this one is like a little more depressing. And sadly, a couple months ago, she did pass away. At least her husband knows that there's no pain in the afterlife. Now before I go any further, make sure to give this video a big thumbs up and subscribe to our channel because it really helps us out and I appreciate it, so thank you. Hit that button. And at number 8 we have The Revival. This story was shared by Reddit user Old Belgian Smurf. A couple of years ago, he almost passed away from drowning. He had been dead for a number of minutes before someone pulled him out of the water and revived him. According to him, all he saw was blackness. The blackness was then followed by a number of lights. The lights turned into stars, and the stars turned into something he said he just can't explain. While this was going on, he didn't feel anything. He was just in the moment. And then before he knew it, he was alive again, laying back on the beach. Moving on to number 7, we have The Surgery Gone Wrong. Over 10 years ago, Reddit user Monitor Monkey underwent a huge surgery. However, it went wrong. During the surgery, he bled out and he was pronounced dead. That's when he woke up in what he described as space. But there weren't any stars or lights. He was just kind of floating in this void, and he didn't feel anything. He wasn't hot or cold or hungry or tired. He just felt at peace. Then he remembers thinking back to his life. Now, it wasn't like his life flashing before his eyes. He was just thinking back to moments in his life. Then he was saved and brought back to life. He disappeared from this space area and was back in his body on the operating table. Now, quite a few people talk about this black void space. It's really quite interesting. Coming in at number 6, we have Mary C. Neal. Mary C. Neal is an orthopedic surgeon who several years ago experienced the afterlife. This occurred when she almost drowned while out kayaking in Chile. Her heart stopped for more than half an hour. I know, that's crazy. Well, soon after, she felt herself leaving her body. She was then greeted by a group of beings, some of who she knew, some of who she didn't. She felt nothing but peace and happiness in their company. Then all of a sudden she was aware that she was headed to heaven, but also aware of what was happening to her on the riverbank where she had drowned. Then, like everyone else on this list, she was saved and brought back into her body. After this experience, she went on to write the book 7 Lessons from Heaven. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the drugs. Reddit user, I don't know, stop asking me, that's literally their name, shared the story of the time his uncle passed away and then was brought back to life. So several years ago, his uncle had overdosed. He was gone for 2 minutes. According to his uncle, while his brain and body shut down, he was sitting at a picnic table at a park behind his childhood home. He was sitting there with someone. He didn't know who, but he knew that he loved them. He was talking to them when they said, "I'll see you later, remember me." Then after this, he was revived. After that experience, he quit drugs for good. Moving on to number 4, we have The Dad. Whiskey Nostalgic on Reddit shared her dad's story with the afterlife. So when her dad passed away, apparently he was transported into this long hallway. At the end of this hallway, there was a door. He walked down the hallway towards the door. But just as he was about to open it, he felt himself get sucked away and back into his own body. Now, what I want to know is what was behind the door? Was it heaven? Was it that void some people have described? I really want to know. In our 3rd spot, we have the great-grandmother. This next person was pronounced dead 2 times in one night. That night, they had gotten into a really bad car accident. All they remember is being pulled out of the car by their great-grandmother. They both then walked through a field of flowers together. She felt at peace. 2 weeks later, she woke up in the hospital. There, she saw her great-grandmother tell her everything was going to be okay before she disappeared. Her great-grandmother had passed away when she was 10 and came back to guide her back to her body. That's an amazing story. Moving on to number 2, we have Jane Seymour. Actress Jane Seymour also had an experience with the afterlife. This occurred in 1988 while she was filming Onassis. While filming, she went into an anaphylactic shock after her bronchitis antibiotics were injected into her vein instead of her muscle. All of a sudden, she saw the infamous white light, and she was looking down on herself from above. She could see the nurse frantically try to save her, and thankfully, she did. All of a sudden, she flew back down and was back in her own body. And in our number 1 spot, we have Eben Alexander. In 2008, neurosurgeon Eben Alexander slipped into a coma after being infected by a rare case of meningitis. When this happened, he was encountered by this spinning clear light. He described this as a portal that opened up another realm. He called it the Gateway Valley. He went on to say it was filled with vibrant plants and flowers and crystal pools. Everything was beautiful and bright. There was also thousands of people there dancing, and gold orbs flew in the sky. After being unconscious for a week, he woke up. Miraculously, he didn't suffer from any brain damage. He went on to write the book Proof of Heaven, and in there he describes in great detail the experience that he went through.
Starting off at number 10 now, we have Julianne Diller. This is honestly one of the most crazy things I have ever heard of in my life. Julianne is a German biologist. Now, when she was a teenager, she was on board Lancer Flight 508 in Peru. The plane was struck by lightning during a severe thunderstorm and broke up in mid-air before disintegrating at 10,000 feet. Everyone on board eventually died, including Julianne's mother, but she did not. She remained strapped in her seat and fell all the way down into the Amazon jungle below. Amazingly, she survived, probably because her seat and the trees cushioned the blow. She tried looking for her mother, but failed. Julianne then spent 10 days traveling down a river in the Amazon until she was eventually rescued by some loggers. Her story has been the focus of many documentaries over the years. Julianne herself has said the question of why she was the only survivor will always haunt her. Next up at number 9 now, we have Michael Holmes. In 2006, this skydiver from New Zealand was very experienced, having 7,000 jumps under his belt. Then one day in December of that year, something went horribly wrong. He jumped out with his fellow divers at 15,000 feet. He took pictures all the way down to 2,000 feet, but when he tried to open his parachute, he just started spinning. He tried to open his reserve parachute after that, but the spinning just continued. He was experienced and he knew at this point that he was probably going to die. He made peace with the world and everything went dark, in his own words. Michael then woke up in a blackberry bush no more than a meter high. He had shattered his foot, his leg, his left hip and his shoulder. It's thought that the bush and the angle that he landed at and that his body was relaxed were all factors in his unlikely survival. Alright, next up at number 8 now, we have Vesna Volovic. She was a Serbian flight attendant who holds the Guinness World Record for surviving the highest fall without a parachute. On the 26th of January 1972, the plane she was on exploded due to a briefcase bomb. Authorities never actually pinned down who was to blame. Vesna fell without a parachute for a mind-blowing 33,330 feet. That's over 4,000 feet higher than Mount Everest. Amazingly, the piece of the aircraft that she was in hit a heavily wooded and snow-covered area which cushioned the impact. It's also thought her low blood pressure kept her heart from bursting on impact. Very grisly stuff. Vesna died in 2016 and those close to her said that she always suffered from survivor's guilt. Alright, next up at number 7 now, we have Nicholas Alkimade. He was a British aircraft gunner during World War II. On March 24th, 1944, his Lancaster bomber was shot down on its way back from a bombing raid. As the plane caught fire and spiraled out of control, Nicholas realized his parachute was on fire. His only option was to just jump without it at 18,000 feet. His fall was broken by pine trees and soft snow and he survived with only a sprained leg. That was it. The rest of the crew crashed and died. When he was captured by the Nazis, they didn't even believe the story he told them. But also, why would you make that up? Seems a bit weird. They eventually believed him though, and Nicholas was held as a prisoner of war until the end of the war. Alright, moving on to number 6 now, we have James Boole. He's a British athlete skydiver who has completed over 2,500 jumps, sometimes doing 5 in a single week. In 2009, he was filming a TV documentary in Russia. He had to skydive next to a volcano to film the shot that they wanted. During the dive, James was so focused on filming the shot that he realized he'd actually gone past his point to release his parachute safely. He knew this because he could actually make out the texture of the snow below him. It was way too late. He pulled his parachute anyway when he was just 20 meters above the ground. It swung his legs up in the air, but his back just slammed right onto the ground. He broke his back and was bleeding internally when the rescue crew found him. Luckily, the break was stable and he suffered no neural damage, which meant that he was able to walk again within a single week. And the craziest part for me is that the accident didn't even stop him from jumping again. Alright, moving on to number 5 now, we have Ivan Chisov. This Russian pilot was forced to bail out of his plane during an air battle. At 23,000 feet, he jumped out with his parachute but did not deploy it. He was worried that the big parachute would make him an easy target for a German pilot. He wanted to get below the battle and then open it. However, due to the thin atmosphere, he lost consciousness and couldn't pull the cord. He slammed into the snow at a blistering 130 miles per hour and then rolled down the hill. The Russian army were amazed to find him seriously hurt but very much still alive. He remained in critical condition but was flying again just 3 months later. Alright guys, next up at the number 4 spot now, we have Joe Herman. This was an Australian Air Force pilot whose bomber was shot down in 1944 over West Germany. Herman ordered his whole crew to bail out, but before he could grab his parachute, the plane exploded and he was just thrown into the air. As he fell, certain of his death, he collided with another member of the crew. He grabbed onto the left leg of the man as he opened his parachute. Luckily, the parachute opened slowly, which helped Joe keep his grip on the leg. The two men landed safely with only some minor injuries between them. I think that has to be a real bonding session for them. Alright, next up at number 3 now, we have Dave Hodgman. This is a really interesting one because there are real pictures of the event. In March 1985 in Australia, Dave Hodgman jumped out of a plane at 12,000 feet as part of a stunt group attempting a formation. On his way down, he opened his parachute at around 2,500 feet and did not realise he was right below another jumper who also didn't know that he was there. They collided in mid-air and their parachutes became tangled. People watched below in horror as they just spun and spun around. Dave's parachute was completely collapsed and they were both relying on the other parachute for their survival. They hit the ground hard but both escaped with minor injuries. Alright, next up at the number 2 spot now, we have Alan McGee. This is an American man who was another World War II pilot. His plane was shot down by the Nazis over France in 1942. His parachute was damaged in the attack and so he jumped from the plane without one at an astonishing 22,000 feet. He quickly lost consciousness due to the altitude. Then he crashed through the glass roof of the train station in the French town of Saint-Nazaire. Amazingly, the glass absorbed a lot of the force of the impact and Alan survived. He was taken as a prisoner of war and treated for his many injuries but made it back to America when the town was liberated in 1945. And finally at number 1 now, we have Shayna Richardson. This one has an insane twist at the end. In 2005, this woman from Missouri was on her 10th dive with a brand new parachute when something went seriously wrong. At about 3,000 feet in the air, her parachute failed to deploy properly. She accepted that she was going to die and slammed into the ground at 50 miles per hour. Amazingly, she survived. Her instructor rushed her to hospital where she needed 4 operations. Now during her time there, scans revealed something else. Shayna had been pregnant for 2 weeks before that dive. The baby went on to have a healthy birth despite the impact in the early pregnancy. That kid is probably a teenager by now. I wonder how often they tell that story.
Starting off with surviving Dahmer. Now unless you live under a rock, then you've definitely heard of the infamous serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. I also watched his documentary on Netflix and I was pretty I'm not gonna lie. Have you guys seen it? Let me know below. He dismembered and murdered 17 men in his run by turning his regular Milwaukee apartment into the butcher shop from Sweeney Todd. Just for SparkNotes version for what used to go down, Jeffrey would lure his victims to his house and do every unspeakable thing under the sun, ranging from cannibalism and medical experimentation to necrophilia. But the main character of the story isn't him, it's Tracy Edwards. Jeffrey invited him over for beer and to watch The Exorcist 3, but when Tracy got there, he very quickly realized he made a grave mistake. Jeffrey forced him to get on the ground while wielding a butcher knife, talking about how he was going to carve his heart out and eat it. As the film went on, Tracy knew he was running out of time. He allowed Jeffrey to handcuff one of his wrists, and after distracting him, he managed to hit him and run outside and flag down a police car. And obviously they then investigated his house and found 4 human heads in his fridge, but I mean, at least Tracy escaped and survived, so there's that. Oh, I would have just cried so hard. I would just be like, just kill me, just end it. End it all. Coming in at number 9 is Bahia Bakari. I think this is honestly one of my worst fears come to life, so I don't even know how Bahia did it, but she did, so kudos to her. So back in June of 2009, Yemenia Flight 626 had 152 people on board it when it crashed into the Indian Ocean at about 2 AM. Despite not wearing a life jacket or being a strong swimmer, Bahia was ejected from the plane and hung onto a bit of debris in order to survive. Apparently there were other survivors since she did hear them, but they slowly but surely started fading away. At about 11 AM, 9 hours after the crash, she was found by a civilian vessel that had been hired to look for the remains of the crash and for any possible survivors. She was the only one who survived it, coming away with just a broken collarbone, fractured pelvis, and more. Which, given the context, is a lot less than I thought it would be. Just saying. Oh, can you imagine? Like, my worst, I'd rather crash on land than crash in the water. Like, I cannot be in the ocean. I cannot. The sharks will get me if the plane crash hasn't already. At number 8 we have buried alive. Now usually if you think your relationship isn't going well or you think you're low-key just tired of your partner, the logical next step is usually just to break up with them. But that was not what Marcin Kasprzak chose to do. Marcin's relationship with his fiancée Michalina Lewandowska was going down the drain, and so he hatched a plan to get rid of her. He, along with his friend Patrick, attacked her with a stun gun, and once she was subdued on the ground for long enough, they bound her ankles and wrists and tied her up. Then, since they apparently hadn't thought of what to do next, they just left her like that for hours until finally shoving her into a cardboard box and driving out into the woods. How did she not cramp up so much while in that position for hours? I would have literally, again, probably died. There and then. There the duo buried her alive under 4 inches of dirt and a 90-pound tree branch. Feeling immense claustrophobia, worried for her 3-year-old son, Michalina knew she had to survive somehow. She used her engagement ring, which is, I guess, good for something, to cut through the rope and claw out of the ground after already being under for 2 hours. Both men involved got sentenced to 20 years each, but I feel like they should have been sentenced to life. How can you not be sentenced to life when you literally tried to kill someone by burying them alive? Your fiancé, no less. Snakery. Filling out on 7th slot is The Hitchhiker. This one comes from Redditor SpazMonkey1949, who said their sister's adopted brother once picked up a hitchhiker who looked like he was in need of a lot of help. The guy got into the passenger seat, and about 10 minutes into the drive, he slit the brother's throat, kicked him out of his own car, and left him to die on the isolated country road. Thankfully, no major arteries were hit, so the brother tied his shirt around his throat and crawled to the nearest farmhouse to get help. Can you imagine having your slit throat and crawling to a farmhouse? Like, I'm stunned. And I mean, they did end up catching the guy and he went to jail, so I guess he did live happily ever after, except, you know, having a scar and a huskier voice. Now at number 6 is Dad. This one was shared by Reddit user birdsmom28, who said when he was 6 years old, he witnessed his dad stab his mother 20 times in front of him and his little brother. He then took a bunch of her blood and started rubbing it on his brother's face, saying, "This is your mother's blood," as their mum lay there almost dead in front of their eyes. The two managed to get her to the hospital in time, which is a ridiculous feat to achieve for a 6-year-old, and they saved her just in time. The dad was then jailed for only 8 years, claiming insanity and that he had heard demons telling him to do it. I feel like it's the biggest cop-out to plead insanity. I feel like that's the easiest way to get out of a sentencing. You just have to go to a psych ward for the rest of your life. Which, I mean, jail is probably better than that. Coming in at number 5 is The Fall. Just reading the story gave me major vertigo. I was like, ugh. Now, as window washers, Alcides Moreno and his brother Edgar were more than used to the risks that came with their job, as well as the high heights they had to work at. But back in December of 2007, the rig they were on disengaged, sending both of them 47 stories down to the ground, which is about 500 feet. When firefighters got there, Edgar was long dead, but Alcides was miraculously alive and conscious. Guesses are that he had somehow managed to ride the platform while falling, which slowed down his descent. I mean, he still had shattered limbs, fractured ribs, and major injuries to his brain and spine, but he did survive. Doctors were shook because surviving a fall from 3 stories or above is usually fatal, let alone managing to survive 47. Even when I see the window washers washing my windows, I'm just like, can you not fall, can you not fall, can you not fall? At number 4 is Not Dead Yet. Angel Resendiz, aka the Railway Killer, killed 23 people across the US and Mexico during the 90s. In 1997, Holly Dunn and her boyfriend Chris Meyer were on their way home from a friend's party when they were stopped by a man asking for money by a train station. After showing them that he had an ice pick, he managed to tie them up and bring them to a ditch nearby. After checking to see whether they'd been followed, Angel proceeded to beat Chris to death with a 50-pound rock. Realizing that maybe he wanted to kill 2 people that night instead of 1, he then raped Holly, stabbed her in the neck with the ice pick, and then beat her till she passed out. Now at this point, Angel thought she was dead, but she was very much not. When she regained consciousness, she managed to drag herself to a house, all while having a broken jaw, shattered eye socket, and a plethora of other injuries. She survived and testified against him, and he was sentenced to death. And mind you, she was the sole survivor of all of his murders, and that is saying something. Good on you, Holly Dunn. You drag yourself out of that ditch, and you testify against him. Filling our number 3 slot is Felix. Cartels are not a joke, people. I know their portrayals in movies and shows like Narcos are dramatized, but they're not exaggerated. You are royally screwed if you end up on a cartel's hit list. Like, it's done. You are over. You are cancelled. Hashtag cancel party is you. Either way, within Mexico, the warring Zeta and Gulf cartels have killed dozens of people in their crossfire. One night, a 20-year-old guy called Felix was walking home when he was picked up by a police officer and dropped off at a Zeta cartel safe house. And keep in mind, in a lot of these places there is no law. The police help the cartel, or the cartel is the law. After being dropped off, he spent the next week being pistol whipped, beaten and shocked while they called his family demanding a ransom. The cartel went as far as to torture and kill Gulf cartel members in front of him, and eventually his family managed to wire them $5,000, but obviously it wasn't enough. They demanded double. In the following months, he was shipped from safe house to safe house, getting beaten regularly until one day he was beaten to a pulp and left for dead on the street. But thankfully, he actually survived. Go Felix. Now at number 2 are the snow tracks. This was from Redditor Laundry Soap, who shared this story on behalf of her boyfriend's mum. Growing up, the mum lived in a weirdly designed house, meaning there were doors leading to the outside all over the house, including in her bedroom. She started feeling unsafe in the house, like she was being watched, and honestly, with that many entry points, I would have been it as well. Her parents brushed it off as her being afraid of the dark, even though she insisted she'd heard her doorknob being rattled from the outside. Things got so bad to the point she'd wake up screaming every night and started sleeping in her parents' room. One night, the dad went to use the bathroom and saw a shadowy figure move down the hallway and the noise of footsteps. Nah honey, you ain't dreaming. He searched the house and found nothing until the next morning. Leading up to every window and door were fresh footprints in the snow outside. It was clear that someone had really been trying to get into the house, and after following the prints, they led the dad to a house where a mentally disturbed teenager lived. The boy admitted he would enter the house every single night and just watch the girl sleep. Like, imagine if that had progressed and he probably would have raped her or killed her or kidnapped her. Imagine being watched every night and you know you're being watched and your parents don't believe you. That's a scary situation. That just happened. Finally, at number 1 is 24 Hours. In Feb of 2006, 5-year-old Jake Finkbonker was playing in a league basketball game when he was pushed from behind and split his lip open on the base of the hoop. Now normally that wouldn't have been a big deal, except the surface of the hoop had the bacteria Strep A on it, which is actually a flesh-eating bacteria. Within hours, the doctors told Jake and his parents that he was most likely going to die because the bacteria was literally eating his face and it was just spreading so fast from his lips to everywhere else, and usually this bacteria doesn't stop spreading until the person is dead. Most patients die within a day of diagnosis, but somehow the infection slowed and stopped. The family believe it was because they prayed to Blessed Kateri Tekakwitha, a Mohawk Indian, and she performed the miracle that saved him.